What was it like being a Roman slave? Ancient Roman slaves were the foundation of the kingdom's economy, up until its end, yet their own lives were not fabulous. A supported slave of a rich aristocrat could live in relative comfort. A less lucky worker could in a real sense be worked to death. Here we are discussing the life of a Roman slave. Old Roman slaves were normally prisoners caught in war. However, some were individuals who had been captured in Italy. These slaves were sold at the slave market. They were put on act exposed with a notification around their necks. Any individual who had sufficient cash could get them. When sold, they were property of their new owner and needed to work for no cash. Some of the time, a rich man would have upwards of 400 slaves. To be a slave in the Roman Republic or Empire implied an absence of legal standing. Slaves had no rights, no belongings, and were treated as their lords saw fit. Slaves could be prisoners of war, hoodlums, or freemen so terrible off that they needed to sell themselves into slavery. With so large a number to how slaves could be secured, their job in the Roman world, and what eventually finished their slavery, it's hard to sum up what life resembled for a Roman slave. Despite this, there are components of slavery that stayed pretty much steady through the Roman world. Slaves in Roman culture were available altogether parts of life. From family homegrown captives to rural workers, slaves were major to financial capacity in the Roman world. For the most part, named metropolitan or provincial, slaves did everything from cooking and cleaning to digging for silver. On nation legacy, slaves may perform both homegrown and non-homegrown assignments, filling in as smiths, cooks, and monitors. A significant number of these equivalent sorts of abilities could be found among slaves working in urban areas, where slaves likewise worked for financial specialists as bookkeepers and chiefs. Prisoners of war were frequently sold as slaves, here and there turning out to be public slaves used to battle fires, watch out for public structures, and fill in as killers. Slaves were property, however, as indicated by Roman law, could accomplish opportunity through a few cycles. The most established and least demanding was essentially being given the opportunity by one's lord, maybe in a will, even though a normal service and installment were typically included. Slaves who sold themselves into bondage could refund their duties over the long haul, accomplishing opportunity once an agreement was finished. Metropolitan and simple slaves both lived in rooms that were far taken out from their lords and regulators. Homegrown workers lived in their lord's home, some of the time, in any event, dozing adequately close to watch out for their requirements short term, yet there were concluded exertion to keep slaves separate from freemen and ladies. Their rooms were frequently situated close to storage spaces and could be imparted to individual workers. Slave quarters in country, Roman manors were comparable, situated in the primary house, yet the specific area stays hazy. Some floor plans show slaves lived nearer to work territories than to their owners. Female slaves were not clear from difficult work, yet they frequently performed individual duties under the sponsorship of first-class and wealthy Roman ladies. Slaves could be prepared to apply beauty care products and do hair or fill in as wet attendants. Ruler Livia, Augustus's significant other, had more than 1,000 companions, a considerable lot of whom were female and male slaves the same. Female slaves were additionally helpless against the desires of male experts. An expert could permit his male captives to have sex with female slaves in any event, charging an expense to do as such. The child of a female slave could likewise turn into a slave. This was one of only a handful, few different ways slaves were framed, not made. The kids were non-people coming up short on any rights. It's hypothesized that during the rule of Augustus, an ever-increasing number of experts attempted to fabricate their slave natives through generation instead of obtainment, an undeniably vital alternative once the kingdom started to restrict its development. Slaves from all pieces of the kingdom were sold locally and at more interesting distances, at times as a substitute bidder. At the point when slaves were brought to showcase, they were stripped, exposed to show potential purchasers that they were solid. Slave merchants were needed to reveal any disorder, just as whether the slave was an outlaw or responsible to get one. Purchasers addressed greater expenses for slaves that were in acceptable condition and had usable abilities. Similar to the estimation of a combatant, a slave that had insight with accounting or bookkeeping or knew about a specialty like stoneware, tannery, or material work was ideal for merchants and industrialists. Exceptionally instructed, slaves could fill in as educators, while ladies were regularly beauticians and perfumers. Solid, capable men may be shipped off work as agricultural workers, but on the other hand were utilized as guardians. Spartacus was a famous old Roman slave who figured out how to get away and structure a gathering of slaves who conquered the Roman armed force in a fight. Despite this, their prosperity didn't keep going for long, as the military figured out how to prevent more slaves from joining Spartacus and executed those that had to experience the fight.